So I'm here today to report on a bit of a tragedy, actually. So apparently this Marxist student decided one day to attend a TPUSA event, ostensibly in order to disperse some of their favorite Marxist talking points and so on. Unfortunately, however, unknown to this kid, what they were actually in for was getting hit with a dose of reality, as the name of this TPUSA clip indicates. So I thought we could go over this video, see what are Charlie Kirk's arguments against Marxism, how well do they hold up to scrutiny, which, since it is Charlie Kirk that we're talking about, I think it's fair to assume that the answer is not very well. And so I guess let's just get into it.
Have you ever considered how most corporations in America are structured essentially like private dictatorships, and most employees do not have any democratic control over their own workplaces? And do you think maybe that's part of the issue?
Just because someone gets rich doesn't mean someone gets poor. When someone works for somebody else, they're getting a wage, they're getting an opportunity. They're being able to get their kids through college, put food on the table.
Okay, so the first thing we need to realize about this argument is it's completely irrelevant to the point that this kid just made. So the kid made a point about the internal organization of the workplace under capitalism, and specifically how that organization is fundamentally undemocratic. And I think that's actually a very good argument, because if you want to organize a society in such a way that it works for the mass of people, then it is fundamentally irrational to organize that society in such a way that the mass of people are excluded from making the decisions that impact their lives in massive ways, right? That's a pretty simple logical deduction. That is why, in fact, we got rid of monarchy, but unfortunately, we never decided to apply that logic to the internal organization of the workplace. And just as a disclaimer, I know this is like market socialist rhetoric. I'm not a market socialist. I have a video about why market socialism is insufficient and it doesn't go far enough. But that's just a short disclaimer. But anyways, I thought that argument that this kid made was a very good argument. But unfortunately, Charlie Kirk never actually addresses that argument. Instead, he goes on some weird tangent about how, well, just because somebody gets rich, that doesn't mean somebody else gets poor. That has nothing to do with what the kid said. It's not a counter-argument in any way. It's just a complete non sequitur from what was asked. But the second thing we have to notice about this argument is he's framing it as a refutation of Marxism. I mean, look, right down here, he's saying, before I cut him off, he was saying where we disagree most with the Marxist left. So he's framing this as like a Marxist myth that, Marxists say that somebody getting rich means somebody else gets poor, and that's wrong. So capitalism is actually good, is like essentially the argument that Charlie Kirk is making. But it's very clear to me that in saying this, Charlie Kirk is revealing that he's never actually read Marx, and he doesn't understand Marx at all. So we're going to read a short excerpt from Wage, Labor, and Capital by Karl Marx. This is from the chapter, The Relation of Wage Labor to Capital. And I think as I'm reading this, if you're paying attention, you'll immediately see the relevance to between this and what Charlie Kirk is saying. So the book says, capital can multiply itself only by exchanging itself for labor power, by calling wage labor into life. The labor power of the wage laborer can exchange itself for capital only by increasing capital, by strengthening that very power whose slave it is. Increase of capital, therefore, is increase of the proletariat, i.e., of the working class. And so the bourgeoisie and its economists maintain that the interest of the capitalist and the laborer is the same, and in fact, so they are. The worker perishes if capital does not keep him busy. Capital perishes if it does not exploit labor power, which, in order to exploit, it must buy. The more quickly the capital destined for production, the productive capital, increases, the more prosperous industry is. The more the bourgeoisie enriches itself, the better business gets. So many more workers does the capitalist need. So much the dearer does the worker sell himself. The fastest possible growth of productive capital is, therefore, the indispensable condition for a tolerable life to the laborer. But what is growth of productive capital? Growth of the power of accumulated labor over living labor. Growth of the rule of the bourgeoisie over the working class. When wage labor produces the alien wealth of dominating it, the power hostile to it, capital, there flow back to it its means of employment, i.e., its means of subsistence, under the condition that it again become a part of capital, that it become again the lever whereby capital is to be forced into an accelerated, expansive movement. To say that the interests of capital and the interests of the workers are identical signifies only this, that capital and wage labor are two sides of one and the same relation. The one conditions the other in the same way that the usurer and the borrower condition each other. As long as the wage laborer remains a wage laborer, his lot is dependent on capital. That is what the boasted community of interests between workers and capitalists amounts to. If capital grows, the mass of wage labor grows, the number of wage workers increases. In a word, the sway of capital extends over a greater mass of individuals. Let us suppose the most favorable case. If productive capital grows, the demand for labor grows, and it therefore increases the price of labor power, wages. A house may be large or small. As long as the neighboring houses are likewise small, it satisfies all social requirements for a residence. But let there arise next to the little house a palace, and the little house then shrinks into a hut. The little house now makes it clear that its inmate has no social position at all to maintain, or but a very insignificant one. And however high it may shoot up in the course of civilization, if the neighboring palace rises in equal or even in greater measure, lost my place, the occupant of the relatively little house will always find himself more uncomfortable, more dissatisfied, more cramped within his four walls. An appreciable rise in wages presupposes a rapid growth of productive capital. Rapid growth of productive capital calls forth just as rapid a growth of wealth, of luxury, of social needs, and social pleasures. Therefore, although the pleasures of the laborer have increased, the social gratification which they afford has fallen in comparison with the increased pleasures of the capitalist, which are inaccessible to the worker, in comparison with the stage of development of society in general. Our wants and pleasures have their origin in society. We therefore measure them in relation to society. We do not measure them in relation to the objects which serve for their gratification. Since they are of a social nature, they are of a relative nature. So, the first thing that we can realize from this excerpt is, one, Charlie Kirk critiquing Marxism by saying that just because somebody gets rich doesn't mean somebody else gets poor is a complete straw man, because Marx never claimed that. In fact, Marx just said the exact opposite of what Charlie Kirk is critiquing Marxism for saying. Secondly, Marx adds a very important caveat that Charlie Kirk completely leaves out in his explanation of this process, and therefore Charlie Kirk presents a very incomplete picture. Because while Marxism says, yes, the growth in the productive power of capital grows the well-being, the material sort of status of the wage labor as well, because they're two sides of the same relation, to the extent that the wage labor to the extent that the wage labor status increases materially, the capitalist's material status increases materially even more because of the mechanism of the extraction of surplus value. And therefore, even though the worker has become better off materially, the capitalist has become even more better off in materially. And since our wants and desires have their root in society and are determined relative to the rest of society, while the worker in objective terms through this process has become more wealthy, they have become relative to society poorer. And that's what really matters, because our wants and desires have their root in society and are relative to society. So, in leaving out that last part, Charlie Kirk paints an incomplete and inaccurate picture in order to make capitalism look better. So I guess that's all I had to say about that. Let's... Oh boy, we're 24 seconds into the video. All right.
Where we disagree the most with the Marxist left is that the Marxists come after this and they will say it is inherently exploitation if someone is gaining wealth. That is wrong. That is fundamentally wrong. If you buy a product...
Okay, wait. I just wanted to say real quick, his framing of the Marxist position is completely wrong. The Marxist position is not that gaining wealth is fundamentally exploitation. If I find a $100 bill on the sidewalk and I pick it up, no Marxist is going to argue that me doing that was exploitative. What's exploitation, from the Marxist perspective, is the relation of wage labor, is the extraction of the surplus value of the worker. That is where Marxists say the exploitation comes in. Marxists do not claim that it is just the general abstract concept of the acquisition of wealth that constitutes exploitation. So right off the bat, we have another straw man.
Not only did someone have to make the product, but they have fundamentally wrong. If you buy a product, not only did someone have to make the product, but they have a job, they have a wage, they're able to provide for themselves. But if your product isn't good, people are not going to buy it. If your product is worthless, people are not going to keep on buying it time and time again. That is why things get better over time. Capitalism.
Okay, so those two arguments he framed as arguments about why capitalism isn't exploitative, because he started out by saying Marxists say that capitalism is exploitative, but in reality, so that's how we're going to analyze these two arguments. Are they arguments against whether or not capitalism is exploitative? And the answer is very clearly no, right? So in order to explain this, let's talk about what exploitation is from the Marxist perspective, because it's very clear that Charlie Kirk fundamentally does not understand this. So from the Marxist perspective, exploitation is defined as the difference between what the worker adds, the value that the worker adds with their work to a given commodity, and what that worker is compensated for in the form of wages. So the Marxist perspective is that workers add more value with their work than they are paid in the form of wages, and that difference is exploitation. And so Charlie Kirk's argument against exploitation is, one, well, if you buy a product, then that means the workers who made that product are getting a wage and being able to take care of themselves. But obviously that fails, because whether or not workers are getting a wage from making a product is irrelevant to whether or not that wage is lower than the value that they added to that product in the process of production. So that fails as an argument against exploitation. His second point was that if you don't, if a commodity which is produced isn't liked by the consumers, then people aren't going to buy it, and that's why capitalism makes things better over time, I guess. That also is not an argument against exploitation, because whether or not things get better over time, whether or not capitalism is good at signifying or communicating the consumer demand or whatever, that is all completely irrelevant to whether or not workers are exploited in the sense of having their surplus value extracted. It's a complete non sequitur. It has nothing to do with exploitation. And by the way, there's an even deeper level. So there's several levels of irrelevance that Charlie Kirk is engaging in here. First of all, both of these arguments are irrelevant to whether or not capitalism is exploitative from the Marxist perspective. And even deeper than that is whether or not capitalism is exploitative from the Marxist perspective is fundamentally irrelevant to the internal organization of the workplace under capitalism and whether or not that makes sense, which is the point that the kid made. So it's so many levels of irrelevance like going on here. Okay. Let's move on to the next point.
people are not going to keep on buying it time and time again. That is why things get better over time. Capitalism does three things: makes prices go down, quality go up, and more people that have more stuff. That is why the poorest people in America are the richest people in the world.
Okay, so let's address this argument. So now he's completely shifted away from exploitation. He's shifted away from the internal organization of the workplace, and he's just making vague arguments about why capitalism is good. And I guess that's fine. It's irrelevant to everything being discussed thus far, but I guess we can talk about that. So his arguments are: one, capitalism makes prices go down, it makes quality go up, and it has more people have more things. And his argument as to how capitalism makes quality go up and prices go down, I guess, as far as quality, that was sort of referenced in the latter half of his last point about exploitation, when he was talking about how if people don't like a certain product, they're not going to buy it, and so then that product has to become better, and that's how things get better over time. That's how quality increases. In order to say that capitalism is a superior economic system or a just economic system or justifiable economic system because it has this mechanism, is in order to argue that, you have to make the assumption that capitalism is the only economic system which has some sort of a mechanism for communicating consumer demand. But that's obviously not true. There are several Marxist and socialist academics who have drafted models of moneyless, marketless, post-capitalist, communist, planned economies which have built-in mechanisms of communicating consumer demand. So, for example, we could talk about like Michael Albert's participatory economics model, where workers' councils submit suggestions for how much they want to produce for a given period of time. Consumer councils come and they submit their proposals for how much they're going to want to consume, and then it goes to facilitation boards, which aggregate that information, take into account other opportunity costs and so on, in order to come up with like iterative prices or whatever. Well, not really prices, because obviously if it was a communist economy, it wouldn't have money and so on, but you know, kind of the equivalent of what prices would signify. And then even besides like Michael Albert, we could talk about Paul Cockshot's model of economic planning, where you see how people are spending their labor vouchers on given things, and then a committee sort of adjusts prices, again, not really prices, but that's besides the point, relative to how people are spending their labor vouchers and so on. And I'm not necessarily advocating for any of these specific systems, but what I'm doing is I'm explaining how there can obviously be models of post-capitalist planned economies which have built-in mechanisms of communicating consumer demand. So Charlie Kirk making this argument that capitalism is superior and it's a good system because it can communicate consumer demand is misleading, and it is false. Another thing that's important to talk about when we talk about the quality of commodities going up, the main driver of quality increasing for commodities is innovation, right? And so again, in order for Charlie Kirk's argument to be valid, it would have to be the case that capitalism is the superior economic system for driving innovation, which because it has a profit motive, which obviously is not true. So there's a study that I like to bring up a lot, that I've brought up in previous debates about communism, when the idea of communism and innovation comes up, where the study is from the Harvard Business Review, and it says essentially that innovations which are made and given away for free are increasingly outcompeting patent-protected for-profit innovations in many parts of the economy. So even in a capitalist economy, where the main emphasis is put on the profit motive, innovations which are made for the purpose of profit are being outcompeted by innovations which are made just because people want to make innovations and give them away for free. And the literal conclusion drawn by the researchers of this Harvard Business Review study is, and I quote, "A profit motive is not needed to innovate." That is literally the headline. That is literally the name of the article. So if you want to look up that study, just look up Harvard Business Review. The profit motive isn't needed to innovate, because that's the primary conclusion drawn by the researchers. So Charlie Kirk's idea that capitalism has this unique ability to make the quality of things go up through its calculating of consumer demand and its innovatory capacity is completely misleading. Another thing he says is that it makes the prices of things go down. While this is actually somewhat true, what Charlie Kirk obfuscates is what this actually entails, right? So one of the primary critiques that Marx laid out in Capital Volume 3 when he was discussing crisis theory is the tendency under capitalism for the rate of profit to fall. And what this means is that while it is true that the prices of commodities have a tendency to go down over time, that is because prices are made based around, not equivalent to, but based around the cost of production. And because capitalism has a tendency to innovate, its productive capacities and make production more efficient over time, that means that the cost of production of given commodities has a tendency to decrease over time, which does mean that prices decrease over time. But it also means that because profit is made from the extraction of surplus value, which comes from variable capital, and because variable capital has a tendency to decrease because of decrease in the cost of production, and because of the increase of productive capacities of constant capital and so on, that means that the rate of profit has a tendency to go down over time. So Charlie Kirk's acknowledgement that prices go down is true, but it also entails that the rate of profit has a tendency to go down over time. And what happens when the rate of profit goes down? Well, it creates bubbles of investment which can't find value, which then spurs an economic collapse. And there's actually data to support this. So Michael Roberts, who's a Marxist economist and studies the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, has released many studies showing that drops in the rate of profit are associated with economic collapse. And furthermore, as the rate of profit falls more and more over time under capitalism, which it has a tendency to do, that means that economic crisis is going to become more frequent and more intense over time. So what Charlie Kirk is saying when he talks about prices going down under capitalism, actually underlying that is an acknowledgement, an unconscious acknowledgement of one of the most crushing critiques of capitalism that there is, which is the acknowledgement that there's a tendency for the rate of profit to fall under capitalism. Thirdly, he says that it makes more people have more stuff. Now, this is a common argument. The whole capitalism makes poverty or decreases poverty over time and makes more people rich over time. It's a common argument, but it's actually on really shaky empirical basis because it's based on World Bank statistics. Because the World Bank sets the world poverty line and then measures of how many people are in poverty are based around that World Bank poverty line. The problem is it's been found that over time, the World Bank has increased or rather decreased the poverty for threshold, or made it harder over time for people to reach the poverty through threshold, thus creating the threshold for poverty, thus creating the illusion that less people are in poverty, when in actuality, it's that less people meet the World Bank's threshold for poverty because the World Bank's threshold for poverty has become harder to reach. And several people have noticed this and actually come up with better metrics for poverty. such as the ethical poverty line, which I think is maybe $5 an hour, which is meant to show the amount of money that you have to have in order to live a comfortable life, or it's even a comfortable, bearable life. And they found that when you look at it from the ethical poverty line, when you ditch the faulty World Bank metrics and look at the ethical poverty line, poverty over time has actually been increasing, right? So this idea that, well, capitalism, it just makes more people have more stuff, it's not true, I guess. And it's based on very dishonest statistical methods. So... But I'm not denying, actually. I'm talking about this in the current day. I'm not denying that capitalism, as it emerged out of feudal society, increased the productive capacity of the world and created an explosion of wealth relative to what existed under feudal society, right? I'm not denying that. But Marx also didn't deny that. Marx talked about that at length. And he talked about how capitalism was a necessary phase in history in order to develop the productive capacities and so on. And therefore, so if that's the argument that Charlie Kirk is making, which I know it isn't because he's not sophisticated enough to make that argument, then it's not actually an argument against Marxism, because Marxists acknowledge that and actually use that as a crucial part of our arguments for socialism. Yeah, either Charlie Kirk here is making a false argument about poverty being decreased in recent years, or he's making a completely irrelevant argument, which refers to something that Marxists have always acknowledged. So either way, he's not making a good argument here.
What about people who don't have any money? If you use money to determine people's wants and needs, then essentially people who don't have any money are going to be left out.
This is,
it's when money is speech.
What do you mean, how do you account people with no money? This is America. If you have no money, you can work hard and you will be awarded for that. I started with absolutely nothing in my life. So I'm the person you're looking for. I'm the person you're looking for. I started my life $150,000 in debt, came from a two-parent home. Apparently, my parents divorced. They couldn't give me any money. I was out on my own since I was 16 years old. I'm doing pretty well right now. You want to know what I did? I didn't turn to the government. I didn't cry. I didn't say white man bad or orange man bad. I got a job and I started working, and I paid down my student loans.
Give it up for Candace!
That was frightening. Okay, so, I guess that was the end. Right? Yeah, the rest of it's just clapping. Okay, so basically that's just the self-made man argument. So the objection that the kid raised is, well, under capitalism, there's some people who don't have any money, and because they don't have any money, they're basically fucked, because that's just how capitalism works. If you don't have money under capitalism, you're not provided for, because you have to buy things in order to survive, which is just true. Candace Owens tried to refute that by saying, well, I was relatively poor when I was young, and then I became successful, so that means there aren't people who are fucked over because they don't have any money. Obviously, that's a ludicrous argument, because for one, say what you want about Candace Owens, I don't think she makes good arguments, I don't think she's honest, but she is undoubtedly an intelligent or relatively competent person who probably got lucky a few times along the way, who's charismatic, who has a speaking ability, who has a high-capacity brain, I guess. And the idea that because one person who's talented and got lucky in their life and is intelligent and charismatic, because that one person was able to become successful, the idea that because that person was able to become successful, that therefore means that there is nobody who's basically fucked over because they don't have any money is completely ludicrous. I mean, what about people in other countries who die because of a lack of food or a lack of medicine or a lack of water, and because they don't have any money, and capitalism only provides for you if you have money and if it's profitable to provide for you, because capitalism is a system based on profit, they're sentenced to death by the capitalist system. What about those people? They didn't have the chance to become successful. They were fucked over because they didn't have any money, right? What about, even if you want to talk about just people in America, What about the 45,000 people who die every year because of a lack of health insurance because they don't have any money? They didn't have the opportunity to become successful. I'm sure a lot of them didn't because they died. A lot of them probably had died at a young age because they didn't have any money. And as this kid pointed out, the capitalist system fucks over a lot of people who don't have any money, right? So, again, we know empirically there's a lot of people who don't ever have the chance that Candace Owens has to become successful. There's a lot of people who are, say, disabled, who are maybe mentally disabled or physically disabled, and therefore don't have the same opportunity to become successful that Candace Owens has. What about them, right? Like, you see, like, there are all these people you can point to where it's like, just because this one person named Candace Owens happened to become successful, even though they weren't at the beginning of their life, that doesn't mean that anybody, that the capitalist system doesn't completely, like, fuck people over who don't have money, right? It's an absurd argument to be making, right? But, all right, I guess that was it. Thank you for watching.